Okay, year 12, we're now ready to take on the essay question in terms of prime ministerial power. This is a question we're going to do. The statement is the Prime Minister is increasingly dominant in the running of the UK executive. Analyse and evaluate this statement. So, the question is, how do you take this question apart? Well, think about your introduction. Define your terms. What do we understand by the Prime Minister in terms of the executive? Now, traditionally, the Prime Minister is what? Primus inter pares, first among equals, amongst the cabinet, which is collectively the chief executive body of the executive. So where's the debate at? Well, debates around the role that the Prime Minister has. Have they actually increased in their role from what it's traditionally been? You know from your own reading and the work of Mackintosh and Crossman in the 1960s that the idea that the Prime Minister has had greater power hasn't been there for a while. So really what you're asking is whether it now is the case as a Prime Minister more powerful, more dominant than before. Have we seen signs of this? Is it most recently the case with Boris Johnson with his centralisation of power in number 10? Or are we considering more about people like Theresa May or David Cameron when he was in coalition government and the fact that they perhaps weren't seen as dominant within their cabinet because of the circumstances that they faced? What you want to do is try to shape that debate argument within about 60 to 80 words to get yourself set up for the rest of the question. Okay, now we know what we're trying to do. Let's think about how do we plan. Well, the first thing to do is like a brain spill. What you throw out is all the different key terms, examples, and everything else you know about prime ministerial power and cabinet government. So it would end up something like this. As you can see here, a whole range of different terms that you'd hope to put into the essay to show off you understand the terminology and you're able to utilise it in a skillful fashion. Once we've done that, we can start to prioritise how these words link together. So if you look at it there, the greens are constitutional powers that are relevant to Prime Minister and Cabinet. The yellows, they're to do with the core executive and the different institutions that exist there and the types of meetings that would exist within the core executive as well. Then we've got to think about the personal and political authority that a Prime Minister might have. Those are the blues, and they might be enhanced or diminished because of those things. And then the kind of examples that we've discussed over time, all the way back to 1976 and the IMF crisis under Callaghan, through Thatcher, Blair, now through to Johnson, and how all of these examples can help to illustrate and develop your analysis in terms of this question. Okay, so how do we look at it? Well, in 3 sections I would suggest. We always consider the perspective first of all, and the assertion would be the Prime Minister can dominate the executive through exploiting their constitutional powers. So what are the reasons to support this? Well, first of all, the benefits of their royal prerogative powers, the ability to hire and fire ministers within a reshuffle. This is shown with Javid, with Boris Johnson in his most recent reshuffle. Also the capacity through royal prerogative powers to control the cabinet agenda. We know the background of this with the example of Mrs Thatcher using her cabinet agenda to try and isolate Michael Heseltine over the issue of Westland helicopters. Or perhaps using collective responsibility to trap a minister in a controversial decision. You could argue that Blair tried to do this in regards to the Iraq war by bringing his cabinet in agreement over whether or not to go to war with Iraq, and people like Claire Short being trapped as a result. Remember, of course, that collective responsibility is a convention, and it can be ignored, and it has been ignored over some key issues, including Europe. The challenge to this is to say, actually, the collective cabinet responsibility implies a collective decision-making, which happens within government. That means it should occur. And some issues, let's be honest, need full cabinet support. Certainly in times of crisis, it's important that the full cabinet is involved in that decision-making, let it be an economic crisis or war. This was certainly the case with Blair after 2005, where he felt he needed greater cabinet support following the Iraq war. Therefore, what can we learn? Well, if we think about the assertion that they can use their constitutional powers, is that definitely the case? Well, it probably is the case in the short term. You can see here how the Prime Minister may be able to exploit their constitutional powers to try and dominate their cabinet. But longer term, perhaps they've got to be aware of the fact that essentially we have a collective decision-making process in this country, and they can't ignore that over a long-term period. Okay, section 2. The assertion this time is the Prime Minister can dominate the executive through centralising power at number 10. So we're looking at the core executive here, and we're seeing how the Prime Minister can use the core executive to control decision making. So Prime Ministers can use cabinet committees and bilateral meetings to make these decisions. Certainly we know this from the style that was used by Blair and by Thatcher. Perhaps there's a greater use of the Cabinet Office to coordinate government policy rather than using the Cabinet. This was certainly the case with the role of Michael Gove that he now holds within the present Cabinet, overseeing Brexit and COVID. Or we could argue about the enhanced role of special advisors in helping with policy rather than ministers. With Tony Blair, the role of Alastair Campbell as Director of Communications, and certainly Dominic Cummings with Boris Johnson. We can see, therefore, that the Prime Minister is seeking to dominate the executive by maybe isolating themselves from their cabinet, so decision-making is more centralised there. We could challenge this, however, by saying that Prime Ministers have to be careful. They can be vulnerable if they remove themselves too far from the cabinet. This was certainly the case with Mrs Thatcher, who by 1990 was essentially removed by her ministers who felt that she was more a liability and not using her cabinet effectively. Some ministers are perhaps too important to remove from decisions. You cannot make all decisions in number 10. Even Tony Blair, who's considered to use number 10 as the main decision-making body, couldn't ignore Gordon Brown as his Chancellor, and that's been the case for other Prime Ministers such as David Cameron with George Osborne. And also remember that Prime Ministers must rely on their own ministers to make decisions. They can't make all the decisions for the government across the whole of Whitehall. Therefore, Boris Johnson has to rely on Hancock and Williamson for decisions in regards to education and health. He can't seek to try and make every decision from number 10. So, what's our evaluation of this? Well, we're arguing that essentially the Prime Minister can centralise power, but there are dangers with this, and ongoing domination through number 10 is probably quite unlikely because it doesn't reflect the fact that there are experienced ministers and a wide range of decisions that the Prime Minister really can't control. We're now on assertion 3. The Prime Minister can dominate through their personal style and political authority. Well, we can certainly support that by saying that the Prime Minister, through their election victories, is the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons. The huge majority is enjoyed by Thatcher and by Blair, and the significant majority that Johnson has now gives him a level of authority and power which probably helps to dominate within the cabinet, and was reflected in the more recent reshuffle that Johnson did. You can also argue that Prime Ministers are the centre of international summits, so therefore they're promoted almost to presidential figures, in the sense that they almost become the head of state of the country in discussions at G8, in the past the EU, and so on. And we also can talk about the media placing the PM at the centre of the government. They clearly focus on the Prime Minister's decisions and the Prime Minister's press conferences. And these are ways in which certain Prime Ministers, Blair being one of them, was a way in which he could control the message that was coming out of the government, but also focus the attention more so on him. We've certainly seen this through the COVID crisis, with the Prime Minister taking a lot of the brunt in terms of his conversations with the public. We can challenge this though. In one way, you can talk about how approval ratings can dip very quickly with circumstances. So even popular Prime Ministers such as Thatcher and Blair, under certain situations of scandal or crisis, can lose their approval ratings very quickly. Recent majorities have also been limited, so to assume that every Prime Minister has a large parliamentary majority they can enjoy ignores the fact that Theresa May struggled without a majority. David Cameron had to deal with a coalition government. Also, media reaction can undermine the authority and cause crisis situations for the government. The media is an ongoing 24-hour thing, and therefore, although it may place the Prime Minister at the centre of the government, can easily damage their authority too. Definitely worth looking at the different patterns of events that have occurred through different Prime Ministers in answering this particular section. So therefore, what is our overall view? Can the Prime Minister dominate through their personal style? Again, there are a lot of circumstances that are reflective of this. Macmillan talked about events being crucial to every Prime Minister, and events certainly can impact upon their political authority and their personal style, and mean that domination cannot necessarily be a long-term thing. So that leads us to our conclusion. Now, your conclusion should have 3 parts. First of all, you decide what your judgment is of the statement. Do you agree or do you disagree? So in the light of the evidence, is the Prime Minister increasingly dominant in the running of the UK executive? If you're going to say yes, then you'd have to also acknowledge the fact there are points that challenge your judgment. So if you say that the Prime Minister does dominate, you'd have to then think about, well, what is it that really challenges this? Is it the fact that there can be inexperienced ministers, that circumstances can undermine their authority? These have to be acknowledged, even when you're saying they are a more central figure. But then you want to really set out why you're giving your particular judgment to the statement. So if you are saying that they are increasingly dominant, you want to be picking out the points that make that the case. Is it the view that they are dominating because they can centralize power in number 10? Is it the case that actually you're looking at their constitutional powers and saying the fact that they can hire and fire their cabinet really gives them a potential to dominate more so than any other minister? So those are the three parts you would expect to see in the conclusion, which will allow you to really justify overall where you've come with your judgment. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. Good luck.